British propaganda in the Second World War had one extraordinarily fortuitous advantage, which is that the war coincided with a real golden age of graphic design. And it was a graphic design boom that began at the end of the First World War. Frank Pick, wanting an identity for the newly amalgamated London Electric Railway, asked Edward Johnston, the calligrapher, and his pupil Eric Gill to come up with a typeface. And from there flowed all the designs of the London Underground, which of course went through everything. It wasn't just the famous roundel, and the lettering, it was the trains, it was the seat covers, everything. Travel posters became a great thing. Shell embarked on a huge campaign, You Can Be Sure of Shell. And indeed, the Guinness ads between the wars were all based on this very strong card of graphic designers. Abram Games was one, McKnight Kauffer, who actually left England shortly after the war started, but was a huge inspiration. And what they'd produced was very big, bold, clear designs that were very suitable for mass reproduction, that were very easily readable. After all, if you were driving past something or you were on a train, you're not going to see it for very long. And they were cheerful images. Many of them, especially the travel ones, of course, were very much about this country and its habits and customs and history. And that translated, that kind of imagery particularly, translated very easily into wartime propaganda. It's your Britain, fight for it. And then also from the more modernist style of Abram Games, who was a great genius at the Ministry of Information, who was in charge of poster design. And his views were much more modernist, not always popular with Churchill. He wasn't looking back to an idealised past, he was looking for an improved future. His ability to make these very brilliant modernist puns on images, so that you see a spade digging for victory turning into the prow of a great ship. Also you see a table which has grown out of their allotment where the food has come from. Brilliant visual images, very sophisticated but very easy to read and understand. I think one of the most unusual and indeed charming pieces of propaganda, and you don't usually think of propaganda being charming, were the images produced by an Egyptian cartoonist who went under the name of Kem. And he told the story of the war in the style of a Persian epic illustrated with miniatures. And one of the best, I think, is this delightful scene here with the arrival of the promised saviours, who do look at first glance like an illustration from a Persian manuscript. But on closer inspection, of course, the first one has a cigar and he is Churchill, and the second one has the pipe and he's Stalin, and the one at the back is Roosevelt with a cigarette. And there's Goebbels falling off the back of a horse and Hitler is strapped across it dead. And I just think it's heaven knows how effective it was as propaganda, but it's the most beautiful, witty and engaging way of presenting a story of events very far off in culture and in space to an audience in terms that they will enjoy and understand. This is one, I think, that one of the great images of the Second World War, never mind British propaganda or propaganda aimed at women. It is this extremely powerful image of Ruby Loftus screwing a breech ring, working in a munitions factory. She's a factory girl, the sort of person who would not normally have featured in art at all, certainly not as an identified individual, and certainly not presented on this heroic, dramatic scale. And it was an extremely effective image. It was hugely popular as a painting, and then it was reproduced in the press everywhere, and Ruby became rather a star. But that elevation of the woman's role to the heroic and dramatic was something that I think had not been seen before. There were other much less effective attempts, of course, to, or at least more patronising attempts to deal with women's efforts. There was Eve in khaki, showing how you could be chic in a uniform, and Eve in overalls, which has a picture of a much less dynamic and professional-looking woman trying to do some very light engineering. I mean, the great thing about Ruby is she clearly knows exactly what she's doing. She's highly trained and highly skilled, and indeed became something of a national star when that image got reproduced everywhere. the racial and national stereotypes involved in propaganda were quite subtly differentiated, and it depended a bit on how familiar people in Britain were with the foreigner in question. During the Second World War, there were very few people who'd actually been to Japan, and so it was thought acceptable and convincing to produce really grotesque racial stereotypes of bug-eyed, buck-teethed Japanese as a spider. And the other thing which was curious was that, on the whole, propagandists had learned that images of hand-to-hand fighting are counterproductive. They're just too horrible. Nobody wants to think about that. But it was okay somehow if you were going to smash Japanese aggression. Smashing the Japs was all right. You could show the Japanese being bayoneted because they were somehow more alien, and people were going to be less likely to identify with them. The most curious, inevitably, I suppose, is Hitler, who could sometimes be a really rather jolly little cartoon figure, and at other times this flesh-eating monster. But of course, the great missing element is the Holocaust itself. And there was, I think, an anxiety about talking about the Holocaust in propaganda terms, in case it was thought to be just an exaggeration. But the main reason was that all the information coming into the Ministry of Information about the mood of the public indicated a very high level of anti-Semitism, and people in Britain, and people were constantly complaining on no grounds whatsoever that the Jews got a better deal, that they got to the front of the queue, that they manipulated things. And so I think quite coldly the ministry decided that talking about the plight of the Jews would not actually attract much sympathy in this country. And so, in the exact reverse of the First World War, it was only really at the end of the war that the general public realised the horror of what they had in fact been fighting.